brother in Ankara.
No, discuss the background.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so right, so here's the title of the talk: Morality and Altruism, Evolutionary Foundations and Economic Implications. So I will talk a little bit about the first part, which is really, you know, one of my research interests in the past, let's say almost 15 years now, to think about the evolutionary foundations of our preferences. And then I will talk about some implications of one particular finding that I have come to work to let's say discover a few years ago. Okay, so I will start out by just really going back to basics. Okay, so I have sort of a general introduction into the whole question of preferences. So what is economics about, right? Economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. And so one of the resources is labor, and then we have raw materials that are made into intermediate goods, and those are put together into final goods. And then the final goods are allocated across consumers. And so the question really is whether the final resource allocation is efficient, in the sense that one could not reallocate or induce changes such as so that a larger quantity, for example, or quality of the final goods would be obtained with the same amount of raw materials and labor resources. Okay, so essentially, what you probably also know, right, is what is called the first theorem of welfare economics, sometimes also known as the invisible hand theorem. And so this theorem is extremely useful because it does identify a number of sufficient conditions for the resource allocation that comes out of a decentralized process to be efficient, right? So loosely speaking, right, if there is a market for every good, if prices are known, if no individual, no firm has power over prices at which goods are traded, then essentially any market equilibrium is efficient, right? So, and what is really particular about this welfare theorem, and which is an idea that dates back to Adam Smith, is that this first welfare theorem is true even if individuals care solely about their own consumption utility, or let's say material well-being. And in fact, it is the first welfare theorem is actually stated under these kind of implicit assumptions about the consumers or the individual's utility functions, right? That they do not care about each other. And so this is well captured in this sentence here from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, right? It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. So this is a very deep insight, right? That markets can function well in a decentralized manner under some conditions. However, we also we of course know that this is it's very hard to find examples of markets in the real world where these conditions are met, right? So, but nonetheless, it's a very useful benchmark. But so what happens in situations that are not covered by the first theorem, right? We can think of a host of reasons for why the first theorem would not apply. For example, in situations with externalities, for example, here is a picture of cars that are polluting the air. And we can think of many other situations where with external externalities, meaning that there is a lack of a market for some goods. So here the good that is not traded is fresh air, right? What happens then? Well, we know that if we are in the presence of either negative or positive externalities, then market equilibria are typically inefficient. So if there are negative externalities, there's too much of it, and pollution example. If there are positive externalities, such as, for example, vaccines, that tend to be too few, too little of the good being traded. Okay, another example is interactions within smaller groups. So for example, interactions within firms take place between a smaller number of individuals. Also notice one really interesting feature, right, is that within firms, there are not like market prices. So within the firms, we have a kind of authoritarian system where you're supposed to kind of obey people that are above you in the hierarchy. And there are clear externalities within firms, and also a host of information problems within firms. For example, it could be that the levels of efforts are not observed, or that there is private information about the quality of the work being performed, and so forth. So there's a host of such information problems within firms. And so typically also to address information problems, one also, these information problems then give rise to inefficiencies unless something is done about them. I should say that I'm now reasoning still under the assumption that individuals are the self-materially interested Homo economicus. Okay, so under the assumption that consumers and individuals are purely interested in their own material self-interest, then externalities and also information problems do give rise to inefficiencies, right? So this is something that economists have known for a long time. As I said, please do interrupt if there is anything you'd like to discuss. Okay, so because of this tradition of thinking of consumers or individuals, employees, for example, as being only interested in their own material self-interest, the economists who in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s thought of ways to address these sources of inefficiencies, they still had in mind the home economics model, the selfish home economics model, and therefore their response was to focus on solutions based on monetary incentives, right? So how do we fix, for example, try to reduce the pollution? Well, we can tax gasoline. How would we increase the number of goods with positive externalities being exchanged? Well, we would seek to subsidize them. How do we solve issues of moral hazard within firms? Well, we seek to establish the right kind of incentives in the form of salary, bonus, and other material incentives to provide the right effort incentives, right? So everything was based essentially on monetary incentives, except in the environmental economics literature, there was also a discussion about, for example, quotas and some other instruments, but the focus was clearly on these material incentives. So, but in reality, preferences can also help fix some of these problems, right? So we need to make our models, let's say, more relevant in terms of seeking to address what we find in the real world, let's say, we need to step away from the purely selfish home economics model, because by now we know that far from everyone is this standard home economics. So, for example, if an individual who experiences guilt when polluting the air will tend to take the car less often, and so this will reduce the propensity to pollute, for example. If in a firm the people do care about their teammates, this will also reduce the propensity to free ride on teammates. Okay, so in situations not covered by the first theorem, it is really crucial, right, to know what people's preferences are to properly address any issues there may be. So economists need to take a closer look at human preferences. And this is not new. As you know, it's been for about 30 years. Economists have done this essentially in the field called behavioral economics. And so there are several different paths, right, to better understanding human preferences. One is to estimate preferences empirically, and this is what is done in experimental economics. One would consist in building theoretical models based on insights on human preferences from psychology and sociology. Fine, right? Then we have a host of different models. And this third way that I'm going to talk about, highlighted in red here, is that we wish to go one step further to understand where preferences come from to begin with. Okay, so by using evolutionary logic, we seek to build a theory of the evolution of human motivation, human preferences. And so this kind of work can lead one to interact also with researchers in evolutionary biology or evolutionary anthropology, because those fields have used this approach for many more decades than economists have. So typically it's very useful and interesting to talk with researchers from these fields to actually enrich the economics models on the evolution of human preferences. But economists, we are very complementary, so we are not reinventing the wheel, because we ask questions which are slightly different from those asked or addressed by evolutionary biologists and evolutionary anthropologists. So what are we talking about here? We are talking about this fact, whether we like it or not, we as living beings are the product of evolution, okay? And so for most of our evolutionary past, we have had to adapt to local conditions to survive. So in modern societies today, let's say the local environment is less salient in our lives, has less of an impact on our ability to survive. But if we think back only a couple of hundred years ago, the local ecological conditions were very much extremely important when it comes to the health, the ability to get the nutrition, with respect to also the risks imposed by the environment, and especially at the time where there were no formal institutions that could step in and protect people from risks, the various risks that were around. So here I have 3 pictures. So just to keep in mind, right, that in the evolutionary past across the globe, so actually the Homo sapiens is I think the only sort of single species that is actually spread across the whole world. And so we have adapted to a host of different environments and climates. And even here, this is a picture of 2 Sherpas, right, with a guy here climbing the Mount Everest, right? the climber here needs this additional oxygen, but the Sherpas, by now we know, right, that Sherpas have a gene that makes them able to breathe with slightly less oxygen than so not only Sherpas but people living at high altitudes in Nepal and also in South America have been found. We now know this, and we also know that this gene has been selected for quite rapidly in our evolutionary past. Okay, so this is very general, right? So, but we should remember this, that we're all product of such evolution. And so the question that I ask in my research on this is, how do evolutionary forces affect the preferences that govern our behaviors in social interactions? Okay, so what is the evolutionary logic? It's very simple. So each one of us here, we have actually think back, right? Start thinking about your ancestors and going back to the advent of life, right? You know, we all come from some cells in the you know billions of years ago, and we all descend from them. That's the truth. Well, okay, there are some people who believe that this is not, but okay. This is how it is. And our, let's say, recent ancestor, let's say for the past 500,000 years approximately, you know, we know from fossil evidence that those ancestors, even prior to Homo sapiens, lived in groups extending beyond the nuclear family. Okay, and so if we have inherited our ancestors' preferences, these preferences should reflect our ability to survive and reproduce in such groups, right? So we have been equipped with preferences that allow us to do so, because those who were not equipped with such preferences, you know, the evolutionary logic is that they were less able to survive. And so let's say it's a kind of a revealed preference argument at the level of evolution, right? So that's the simple idea that we're going to use to build this theory of the evolution of preferences. Okay. So the question is really this, right? So in some sense, reproductive success. So for simplicity, I mean, human beings were very complex. Some of our preferences are determined by culture, but part of it is determined by our genetic makeup. So we do not know precisely, you know, what aspect of our behavior is genetic, what aspect is cultural. But so that's an empirical question, which is extremely important. But for the time being, I'm going to just take the very simplest possible idea, which is to say that suppose that everything is genetic, because then it's easy to know which path the behaviors would have traveled, right? So, but these, we should keep in mind that these models can also be, can also take into account cultural evolution, right? But for simplicity, think now just in terms of evolutionary success is the number of children that you get and that survive to adulthood. Okay, so if reproductive success is what is driving evolutionary success, then the question is, well, shouldn't humans simply then be expected to seek to maximize reproductive success? It seems like an obvious thing, right? It seems like an obvious conclusion. How could anyone who does not maximize reproductive success win the evolutionary race? Okay, but surprisingly, there are many reasons for why our preferences may be expected to not solely be to maximize reproductive success. Okay, and that's what this theoretical literature is about, is to identify reasons for why the answer to this question would be no, right? So conditions when this is the answer here is no. So the seminal papers in economics, I'd cite these two papers as being the first ones really to ask this question and to provide formal models. So there's this paper by Robert Frank in the AER in 1987. So it's a paper called something like, if Homo economicus could choose a utility function, which utility function would he choose? And then there is a Gut and Yari paper in 1992, who go, let's say this is really the paper that provided the first formalization of what is called the indirect evolutionary approach, and which is still used I use in my work, and it's used in this literature. And so the key point of this paper here was to propose a model in which you have preferences that guide the behavior. The behavior gives rise to equilibrium material payoffs, and the equilibrium material payoffs guide the reproductive success or evolutionary success. And then from there, one can make predictions as to which preferences have or would be the winners of the evolutionary race. So as I said, the main challenge of this research is to answer this question up here and to understand why or why not this is the case. Why our preferences may differ from simple maximization of reproductive success. Okay, any questions here? Is this clear? Okay. Okay, so what I'd like to do in the next half hour or so is sketch of the evolutionary model that Jürgen Webel and myself worked on, and we published 2 papers with this particular model. And I'm going to talk about the main result, and which is that evolution favors a specific type of preferences that we called Homo moralis. And then I will talk about the implications of these Homo moralis preferences for standard, let's say, economics models. And I will compare also to what is known as altruistic preferences. I will tell you what these are later on. So I will talk about four illustrations. So voluntary contributions to public goods, tax compliance, incentives in firms, and also repeated games, an infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma. All right. So let's think about this model of the evolution of preferences in social interactions. And I really like to think about pre-industrial times, where the environment was quite stable throughout generations. Of course, there were shocks, but more or less, most people lived as self-sustaining farmers and in a climate that did not vary too much, right, in local conditions. And so this is the kind of society that I would like you to have in mind now. And so what is the idea? The idea is, this is something that I tend to want to do always in my research, is to think about, there is a population that lives in a certain part of the world. And so there are some local conditions, right? The climate, the soil quality, etc. And then people work. And for example, it could be teamwork. That's what I will call social interaction, is that there are some externalities between the actions of people. So it could be, for example, teamwork, working together in the fields or something like that. Okay, these two things together, right, the efforts and the local conditions, give rise to some kind of material payoff, which could be, the amount of food harvested. It could be the quality of the shelter that is being built, depending on whether the teamwork is functioning or not. And these things in turn affect, the number of births that these people would get, the death rates, and also migration. Okay, so this kind of, if wheel would every year you would have these events, and so in the longer term, the question is, the preferences that guide the choices of here, which ones would have a long-term survival value. Okay. So, for example, right, suppose that in each generation, individuals work in teams of 2, just to make a very, very stylized model now, right? So let's simplify things as much as possible. So suppose that individuals work in teams of 2 people. And here I'm going to introduce this notation, pi of x and y. What is this? This is the material payoff that an individual who makes effort x obtains when the other makes effort y. Okay, and this is also what drives evolutionary success, is the material payoff. Okay, and now, so suppose that each individual has some utility function or goal function that guides behavior. So this utility function also depends on the effort level chosen by the individual himself and the effort level chosen by the other individual, right? So it could be, I have some cost of effort, but I can also be pleased or displeased by the fact that the other makes more effort, so one can imagine many different kinds of utility functions like this, right? And so the question is here, remember this question, will evolution lead to self-interested individuals whose goal function is simply to maximize material payoff? Or is there some other goal function that will arise as a winner? Okay. So the analytical tool that we use is based on an extension of the evolutionary game theory concept of an evolutionarily stable strategy. So this is something which was defined by evolutionary biologists Maynard Smith and Price in 1973. So here's how this works. Consider it's like an equilibrium concept at the population level. So we consider an infinitely large population to make things simple. And we suppose that a share 1 minus epsilon of this population, they have the goal function u index theta of xy, okay? So the population is almost entirely composed of such people, and I will call them residents. And then there's a share epsilon who have some other goal function, u index tau of xy. I will call these the mutants, right? And so here in this population, individuals are matched to interact in these, 2-player interactions. And so they play, they have their utility functions, and so each individual in the match seeks to maximize own utility. And so they reach some Nash equilibrium, they play some Nash equilibrium, and each individual obtains the equilibrium material payoff that comes out of the equilibrium strategies used. And then one can evaluate what is the average material payoff that residents get, and what is the average material payoff that mutants get. And so we will say that the goal function u theta is evolutionarily stable against u tau if residents get a strictly higher average material payoff than these rare mutants. Okay, then the resident goal function can prevent the entry of the mutant goal function. Okay, yes, question?
Yes, I would like to ask how these residents actually differ from mutants. I have difficulty interpreting.
You have difficulty interpreting
the differences of these residents and the others.
Okay, so for example, it could be that the residents are Homo economicus, for example, right? So suppose that actually the residents, they're like this. They solely, each such individual chooses a strategy that maximizes own material payoff. And suppose that the mutants, perhaps they have a utility function which consists in maximizing the sum of the material payoffs in the pair, right? So given, okay, so the question then is, so given this, they at the population level, you have some pairs, some teams where you have 2 Homo economicus, you have some pairs where you have 1 Homo economicus and 1 of these other kind of social planner types. And then you have teams where both are social planner types. Okay, and so actually in the work, in the papers that I'm talking about here, these interactions take place under what we call incomplete information, that you probably know, right? Incomplete information, so they do not observe each other's preference types, but so they play Bayesian Nash equilibrium. And then, so we take these Bayesian Nash equilibrium strategies and we evaluate the equilibrium material payoffs that the Homo economicus get and the equilibrium material payoff that these social planner types get. Okay, did I answer your question? And we take this epsilon to be small and we check whether when epsilon is small, the residents get a strictly higher material payoff than the residents. If they do, then it's evolutionarily stable. If they don't, then that means that the mutants can invade. They have a higher evolutionary success, a reproductive success, they can invade, and then U theta is not evolutionarily stable. Okay, yeah. And so if we can identify a specific goal function, which is evolutionarily stable against all the possible mutant goal functions, then we have identified such a goal function, which is simply evolutionarily stable, right? It will withstand the invasion by all possible mutants. And that's the goal of our analysis, is to identify such evolutionarily stable goal functions. So what we do in these 2 papers is that we also take something which is highly realistic in our evolutionary past, which is that matching of the individuals who interact is assortative. What do we mean by this? It means that a person who has the rare mutant utility function has a greater probability than residents of being matched with another rare mutant. And this type of assortativity arises as soon as the population is structured into groups. So for example, think of these groups as being villages, okay? So, and suppose that suddenly, you know, there is this one mutant individual who is born in one village. Well, that person may stay in the home village and get children there, and then descendants. And so the descendants of the initial mutant will tend to interact with each other because people do not migrate out into the larger population very much. And so different in our evolutionary past, I mean, some people did move out to other villages, others did not. So clearly this kind of assortativity is part of our evolutionary past. And this is actually really what drives the result. And then what we do is we have to make some assumptions about what is the set of potential goal functions. And we here make minimalistic assumptions on this. We say, okay, goal functions could be any continuous utility function. Permutation, okay, forget about this. This is just technical, it's not so important. But what we want to do is really say, we don't make any prior assumptions about what the preferences are. We take any continuous utility function. And what comes out of this exercise then is the following. It's the following a utility function here. This is the utility function which for all the games, the interactions that we allow for, which is also meant to be a very sort of generous set, it's this function here, which has two components, right? So the first part here is the own material payoff, pi xy. And so this is the standard selfish component. And then we have the second part, which is pi xx. What is that? So x here is the individual's own strategy. So pi xx is the material payoff that the individual himself or herself would get if, hypothetically, both players were to choose x. So you see, y here is the other's real strategy, right? So imagine that I'm this, have this goal function, then I will evaluate my strategy x, both in light of what my true material payoff will be, but also what my material payoff would be if the other person were to choose the same strategy as me, hypothetically. And I attach this weight kappa to the second component. Now, when we saw this, so this is something that came out of the math, when we saw this expression, it made us think about Immanuel Kant, Kantian reasoning. So the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who, of course, has written this incredible body of writings on morality. And one of the key features of Kantian reasoning is to evaluate what would happen if all others were to do like me, right? And this second component is, in some sense, so it's evaluating material payoff in the light of what this material payoff would be if all the individuals, here there are only two individuals, but nonetheless, then all the individuals were to choose the same behavior, the same strategy. And that's why we call these homo moralis, because they it made us think about this moral Kantian reasoning, right? So in some sense, these homo moralis preferences express a compromise between self-interest and the right thing to do. And kappa here is something that we call the degree of morality. These preferences are new to economics. So in the behavioral economics literature that is inspired a lot by, psychology or sociology, you have a host of different utility functions, but this one had never been studied before. So that's why we thought also it would be interesting to examine what the consequences of these preferences are for in sort of standard economics problems, models. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. So the utility is not capturing the disutility from playing by, right? So it is just a utility. We are not taking any disutility from playing by.
So this pi function could be many different things. So yes, but this our analysis applies to any game, any interaction in which pi is a continuous function of the strategies x and y, and for existence of equilibrium, we impose. Then we need assumptions such as strict concavity and so forth. But indeed, one could also take these preferences and apply them to other kinds of issues where you have, where pi may be decreasing in x, or you have these disutilities, if you wish, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So. Okay, so what I would like to do now is, as I said, examine the consequences of these preferences in some standard problems. So again, this is the material payoff as before. I will compare the homo moralis, the consequences, the behavioral consequences of homo moralis with this other utility function, which I will refer to as altruistic preferences. And what this utility function does is it has this selfish, so the own material payoff with a weight 1, and then a weight alpha attached to the other's actual payoff. So you see here, xj is the other's actual strategy. So it's altruistic in the sense that it really takes into account the effect on the other's material payoff. So it's consequentialistic. So a key difference between these two utility functions is that this altruistic preferences are consequentialistic, right? So the individual evaluates what is the consequence of his or her behavior on the other. But the homo moralis, they are not consequentialistic. Homo moralis does not care about the other individual per se, right? The homo moralis only cares about own payoff, but the true material payoff, and then what he or she would get if both were to do the same thing. And so we'll see, sometimes these will behave in a similar way, sometimes in a very, very different manners. And this is kind of so it's a special case of maybe you're probably familiar with the inequity aversion model. This would be a specific case of the inequity aversion model. Yes, Kivanch.
Yep. So I think I'm going to be taking us a bit back, but how do we define the right thing to do in this context? Is this something arbitrary for any interaction? Because when I think of Kantian morality, there is this imperative which is like a normative aspect to it. Do we define the right thing to do, or is it?
No. So indeed, you're absolutely right. So the let's say the right thing to do would really be having kappa equal to 1, right? So you would forget about your own material payoff. You would simply think about what is the thing I should do if everybody chose to do that. So that would be kappa equal to 1, the pure Kantian. But indeed, this utility function is more, let's say, allows to look at intermediate degrees of such morality, where the individual trades off these two goals. Indeed, yeah. So it spans this parameter kappa, which can take any value between 0 and 1, allows to span this whole continuum between the selfish homo economicus, which obtains for kappa equal to 0, and the pure Kantian for kappa equal to 1. Okay,
thanks.
It's Yuri.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, sorry, probably I missed something because I lost the connection for a while, but I'm missing a point here. I mean, the utility that this homo moralis individual is getting from choosing the same strategy as the other player. I mean, the only key into identifying that morality is just that they choose the same stuff, or I mean, there are other reasons I'm thinking that for.
Okay, so it's not conformity. It's not, if I know what you're doing, it's not. It's different from wanting to align one's behavior on others' behavior. That would be kind of conformity, right? If I know that you're contributing this or that much to public good, maybe I want to do the same. Maybe I think it's a social norm and I want to conform to it. No, this is different, right? Here it's I look at in the public goods game, for example, I look at what is my payoff given what you do. So maybe you contribute 0, right? So then I know, okay, this is the payoff. If you contribute 0 and I contribute so much, but I also think about, okay, what would actually happen if Yuri, instead of contributing 0, contributes 5? And I get utility from hypothetically creating this world in which we both contribute 5. So one way to think about this also is, what is the action I would choose if if I were the leader and Yuri would follow my lead with some probability. That's another way of interpreting this mathematical expression. Okay. Yes.
So like I was like, so as far as I understood, like this preferences dominates the other ones because individuals that carry those preferences on average get more material.
Yeah.
So like I was wondering, like, what if like there is only one individual that carries that mutant? Because like if he or she is not able to, like, I think like, as if I understood it correctly, those individuals will get more because whenever they match with the same mutant,
Yeah.
like they will gain more because like they all like care and like have moral values. So like I was wondering, what if only one individual have that mutant and like others don't have? Because like if we want to have like such a gene in the population, it should like start from some point. But if
for sure, that's very, yeah, no, you're completely right. So in these papers that I mentioned, we have a continuum population, and the share of mutants is epsilon. So that's by definition, it's what more than one individual, okay? Because it's an infinite population, and it's a share epsilon of that population that are mutants, right? But we actually have another model that was published in 2020, in which we have another approach, which is to indeed have just one individual come in as a mutant first. But then the model is different, because what we then do is kind of explicitly follow the descendants of this initial mutant. And these descendants, so after the first generation, right, then there are several of these mutants, and they may spread out in the population more or less. And so then we can also endogenize this associative matching. But yeah, so but in this approach here with the here we have an infinitely large population, so we avoid the issue that you talk about. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this coming back here, then I will compare the behavioral implications of these two utility functions. So first look at a public goods game. So with the material here, I look at with n individuals. So actually also the paper in 2016 is where we extend the whole analysis to n player interaction. So we can define also homo moralis for n player interactions. And in this paper here in games, we do this comparison of homo moralis and altruistic preferences. And one thing we look at is the public goods game. So and here it turns out, right, that here homo moralis and altruistic preferences have the exact same behavioral implications. So the equilibrium contributions are the same. So here we see that for homo economicus, the contribution is declining in the size of the group, but then for high levels of morality, actually the equilibrium contributions are increasing in the size of the group. So, okay, so but here there's no difference. Homo moralis act as if they were caring about the other individual. Okay, let's turn to a case where they're very different. So the question here is, why do people pay taxes, right? There is evidence that people pay more taxes than they should if they only paid because they feared being caught if they don't pay. So in a taxation model, a homo economicus would pay taxes only because of fear of being punished. I mean, there is no other reason to pay taxes otherwise. What if a taxpayer has altruistic preferences? So, if I pay taxes because I think that the money I pay can help the poor, for example. Well, if, I live in France, there are 60 million people. Well, if I pay a little bit more or less taxes, it will not really help many more poor people. So, and I know that some money disappears in the bureaucracy. So maybe then okay, I will pay taxes, but only if I fear being punished. I mean, this altruistic drive cannot generate tax compliance if the taxpayer has a very negligible impact on the total tax revenues. Homo moralis preferences here are very different because the taxpayer will then evaluate what the tax revenues would be if a share kappa of the whole population would choose the same level of tax compliance. So it's as if the individual now had a large impact on total tax revenues. And so the bottom line here is that a positive degree of morality induces tax compliance even in the absence of monetary incentives. So this is work by a PhD student of mine who is currently still at TEC. Incentives in firms. Suppose we have a firm owner who hires a team of workers and she only observes total output. Then the salary must be based on total output. Suppose that the total output depends on all the employees' efforts. If the employees are altruistic towards each other, they will internalize the effect of the effort choice on the others. If there are homo moralis preferences, then each employee will evaluate the total output that would obtain if all chose the same effort as him or her. The key point here is that the consequences of these preferences for the kind of incentives that the firm owner needs to put in place to induce high effort levels, these consequences are different. So sometimes, depending on the parameter values, the firm owner will prefer to hire a team with altruistic employees, but sometimes it's a team with homo moralis. You can see also now that actually firms may contribute to the selection, the evolutionary success of different preferences, right? If firms never want to hire, let's say, selfish people, then selfish people will be unemployed, they will be worse off, and this can have longer term consequences on the composition of the population in terms of preferences. This is work by a former PhD student of mine, Roberto Sarkisian. Finally, I don't know if I have time, maybe I'm running out of time, but
actually, if you have time, we have time to go on for some more time.
So yeah, this is just the last example, so it will not be very long. So let's see here a prisoner's dilemma, right? We have a two-player game with two strategies, cooperate or defect, and here are the standard payoffs associated. So someone who defects against someone who cooperates get the T for temptation. If they both cooperate, they get R for reward. If one defects, if they both defect, they get P for punishment. And the person who cooperates when the other defects gets S, the sucker's payoff. So I look here only at this Grimm trigger strategy. That is, the Grimm trigger strategy is, cooperate until someone defects, then defect forever. This strategy can sustain perpetual cooperation if players are sufficiently patient, right? So delta here is the discount factor. So maybe do you know about this result, this Falk theorem from the 1980s, right? Okay, so now what if players have altruistic preferences? Then the payoffs are modified in this way. Now they have, this is own payoff from defecting against a cooperator, but now also taken into account by weight alpha, the other's payoff. We get this payoff matrix. And now we get the conditions for Grimm trigger to sustain cooperation to look like this. I will show you a picture later. For homo moralis preferences, it's slightly different. So now we have here someone who defects against a cooperator attaches a weight 1 minus kappa to the own material payoff, but now a weight kappa to the payoff that he would get if both were to defect. So that's P now. So now we get different thresholds here on delta and kappa for Grimm trigger to sustain cooperation. So depending on the payoffs, here's an example. Here the T minus R is not so big. So the temptation is not so big, the temptation to deviate from cooperation is not so big, then cooperation is always sustainable for large enough values of the discount factor, and for alpha and kappa large enough, any discount factor is fine. But if we have a bigger here reward from temptation, from defecting, if t minus r is 4, what happens is, on the one hand here, we see that now homo moralis is here, it was altruists who were better at cooperating. Here it's homo moralis who are better able to sustain cooperation. And interestingly, this is also the same thing we should keep in mind, is that these preferences are not always good, in the sense that they do not always help to increase efficiency. In this case here, for intermediate values of alpha or kappa, cooperation is not sustainable through grim trigger. And why is that? Because with these numbers here, an altruist or a homo moralis, they are not willing to punish a defector, right? So if I'm very altruistic, then it cannot be sustainable to defect forever after someone has defected. So this is also, we should keep that in mind, that these preferences sometimes solve problems, but sometimes it can also introduce novel problems. Okay, so this leads me to the conclusion, right, that we combine in this work economic theory and evolutionary logic to build a theory of the long-term evolution of preferences. And I think that it allows us to understand which forces in our evolutionary past have shaped our preferences. And it can also help us understand differences between different parts of the world, because we have evolved in different ecologies. And it may also help us study how economic systems affect preferences. For example, as I was mentioning, firms can prefer to hire moral or amoral or altruistic people or spiteful people. This will may have consequences on the future composition of populations in terms of these preferences. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for this. And if you have questions, I'm willing to stick around for a while, but I know it's also late where you are, so we can also stop here, and you can contact me via email if you'd like.
If possible, we would like to have just a little bit of
Sure.
your time for the questions. I think
yeah. Should I stop sharing the screen maybe? So
yep, why not?
We can switch to right. Yeah.
So can I ask something?
Of course.
So I immediately thought of cultural differences, as you also pointed out in the last slide. I might be approaching this from a completely irrelevant perspective. My apologies if so, but I feel like there are some very, severe cultural differences in terms of preferences. Like, for example, I believe that I am living in a society in which, Kantian morality is seen as stupidity, perhaps.
Okay.
But some other societies have different degrees of maturity. Like the Scandinavians are even afraid to fly because they think it pollutes too much. So can we explain these, very recent cultural differences from an evolutionary perspective, or do we need some other lens for this question?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And first of all, I think that we can all sense that there are differences, and indeed, I would tend to agree with you. I've lived in a few different countries, and I think that there are quite important differences sometimes. Although it would be interesting to quantify more, but yes. So how can we explain these? I mean, indeed. So what this evolutionary, this body of literature now suggests some potential answers to your question, right? That factors that can have led to these differences. So if we just look at the model that I presented here, then one difference would be the extent, for example, migration rates. So if so the kappa, that the value of kappa, which is evolutionarily stable, is driven by this assortativity in the matching process. And so what the assortativity also is driven by, it would tend to be, so the assortativity is higher if the migration rates are low. So think about this example again of a village, right? And you have the initial mutant. If people never migrate out, then, and if the mutant is successful locally, then eventually the mutants will take over the whole village, right? And there the kappa will be very high because, so here the assortativity will be very high. The descendants of the initial mutants will all interact and, okay. If you have instead a population where most people migrate away from their initial village, in the village they were born into, then you would tend to see a lower degree of assortativity, and then our model predicts that then you should have more selfish individuals. Okay, so that's one, let's say, the theory can help us come up with hypotheses for why we might have cultural differences today. So in some sense, but of course it's difficult to find really good data, but in some sense we do have testable predictions. But of course then it becomes more complicated if preferences are culturally transmitted, right? Because then the paths that preferences can take in a population are much more complex. For example, if today people adopt preferences that they see represented in TV shows, right? What will the implications of that be for those preferences? But it's an empirical question, right? It's an empirical question. To what extent are these things genetically determined, and to what extent are they culturally malleable? And of course, then there are other things like, so someone mentioned, Yuri, I think conformity plays a role, social norms. We tend to want to also be like the others around us. So that can exacerbate these cultural differences, right? So, yeah. But yes, I mean, to me, that's a key sort of insights, or at least, at least we can try to understand the mechanisms behind these differences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, Minaya.
Thank you for the presentation. First of all, I have a very short question. By listening to the tax-paying example, we know that the utility function of altruistic preferences is including the other's utility to its own utility. But while saying tax-paying, we said that for altruistic, in altruism, we are even though it is negligible, it has negligible effect, we are paying because we are afraid of the punishment.
Yes.
So is that so? Because I thought that we are looking at the other's utilities. So how is that the relationship between this? Because I didn't get the idea behind the tax-paying example for altruism.
Well, so the idea is that take a very, very stark model in which you know that your taxes have essentially zero effect on the total amount, right? You're like one drop in the ocean. So if you feel like a drop in the ocean in terms of affecting the outcome, even though you would like to help, let's say you would like to solve all the problems of the world and help all the poor people, well, the few hundred euros or thousands of euros that I pay in taxes, it's not gonna help a lot of people, right? And the thing with homo moralis is that even if I know that my little contribution does not have an effect at all, and so in the model that I mentioned, the stark assumption is that actually there's also continuum population, so that actually the tax has zero effect, has no effect. I mean, each individual has zero weight. Then, so even in that very stark case, if you're homo moralis, it gets you to behave as if you had a large impact on the tax revenues. Okay, and so you know that you don't have any effect, but you get satisfaction from paying the taxes and from knowing that, okay, well, if 20% of the population did like me, then we could really make a difference in terms of helping poor people.
So in the altruistic one, we don't take into account others, like simply others' tax payments, but in the homo moralis, we take into account. So this is the main difference. So now I get idea. Thank you. Okay. If I get wrong.
Yeah, no. So the key difference is really that like the homo moralis evaluate what the outcome would be if a share of 20, let's say 20. If my kappa is 0.2, if I have a degree of morality of 0.2, then I ponder what the tax revenues would be if 20% of the population chose to the same tax compliance as I do. Okay, so it's as if I had great power over 20% of the population. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, Selim?
Thank you. I don't know how much my thinking is valid in here, but how we're going to put free rider in this picture, like tax example in this model, like should we adapt kappa, or how we're going to adapt the free rider problem in this issue?
Oh, you mean what are the policy implications? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, like we talk about the altruism, but on the other hand, like some of those people will not actually, if have a chance, will not pay the tax.
Yeah.
So how are we going to put this in the model?
Sure. Yeah, so then you could have a model where you have some taxpayers who are homo economicus, others are homo moralis. You know, it's an empirical question as to what is the distribution of preferences, right? Some are clearly very homo economicus, but others maybe not be. And it's true that, you know, I remember a few years ago you had the Swedish minister. She was saying, well, you know, Swedes like to pay taxes. So, you know, maybe it's true, but so in any event, I think that there is heterogeneity. And so, yes, one could calibrate, you know, potentially, you know, if we were to find some kind of natural experiment where you have a change in the monetary incentives to pay taxes, how many people actually do change their behavior? Maybe some do not change at all. Those, yeah, may be driven by more intrinsic motivation. And what exactly is driving them? Of course, it could be that they may have wrong beliefs about the probability of being caught. They may overestimate the probability of being caught. That's another explanation, right? But so potentially, you know, what Esteban Munoz analysis suggests is that the homo moralis, this Kantian morality, can help explain why people pay taxes, even though they know that they have zero chance of getting caught, for example. I don't know if I'm answering your question actually, but then one can, given if one knew the true distribution of motivations for paying taxes, one could think of calibrate the tax levels, perhaps calibrate the target, adapt the penalty rates, adapt the audit rates, depending on this heterogeneity. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, a bit picture clarified. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right.
Okay, so if there are no other questions,
There's one more question. Yeah.
Well, I have a question too, but it might be out of the scope of the presentation. Are you okay with that? Can I ask?
For sure.
So first of all, thank you for the presentation, for this massive presentation. I really liked your way of approaching economic problems through evolutionary forces. So my question is there any particular study in finance which, approach those type of questions through evolutionary forces?
So in finance, so you have in mind, for example, risk attitudes. Is that something you would have in mind? Like preferences, for example, risk aversion, or yes. So there are several papers on the evolution of risk attitudes. And so the authors that you should look up are, so I'll write it here. Okay, here. So, oops. So Arthur Robson is one person. So he's a professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And he has written a large number of papers on preference evolution in decision problems. Okay, so this is distinct, right, from what we're looking at, preferences that govern strategy or behaviors in interactions. So he's looking at decision problems. So the reasons for why evolutionarily viable preferences are different from simple reproductive success maximization are different from in the social preference literature. But he also has, let's say, if you look at, for example, the paper he has from 1996 on, I think it's a JET paper 96, there he also simply relates actually, why we would expect it to have expected utility. So von Neumann-Morgenstern preferences. And so relates that back to features of fecundity. There's also another researcher who has written some about this, is Nick Netzer, who's in Zurich. And if you look up their papers, then you will find others as well that are about preference evolution in the domain of risk attitudes. And also time, so intertemporal preferences, also the distance. So there's quite a few papers on what kind of discounting we should expect to see. Okay.
All right. I took my notes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And I think there's another question there. Ubaid?
Yes. I'll just make it quick. If we were to do an empirical analysis, how do you think we can include the cultural variable? Are there any data sets which has this thing?
Which variable? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
For cultural differences, for example.
Okay. Cultural differences. Yes. Well, so I mean, in the experimental, most of the papers that exist now, which are actually quite recent, that structurally estimate preference parameters, right? Those are based on very simple experiments, right? So dictator games, for example. So you have this paper by Ernst Fair and others from 3 years ago in the Journal of European Economic Association, where they do this. And then, of course, you have also the work by Armin Falk and others. And so if you're interested in cultural differences, that's where you should check out his work. So they have this massive collection of data across different countries. They based on kind of simple questions, and they try to capture altruism and other features that have been around in behavioral economics for some time, but they do not look at Kantian morality at all. So
Thank you. Sorry. As a thought experiment, can we say dictator game represents capitalistic mindset or capitalistic society?
Dictator game? If they
Yes.
I don't think so, right? I mean, dictator game is what you get some suddenly you get some money or some resource, and you get an opportunity to share it, some of it, with someone else. I think that's have been part of human society for hundreds of thousands of years.
But can we characterize it as a capitalist mindset? For example, if you are getting someone like thinking about, or maybe greed, how can we classify? That's what I'm thinking. For example,
Yeah,
if we look at
that's a super interesting question, right? To what extent has, for example, to what extent do markets make us more selfish or not? Do they, right? And so there's also there's another person who has done really interesting work, Sam Bowles. Also, he's looking at, for example, how well, actually both theoretically and also experimentally, he has examined how monetary incentives themselves can reduce the intrinsic motivation to act pro-socially. Okay, so his approach is to say that there's something in our psychology which, if money comes into the picture, then it will trigger some other kinds of preferences than if there's less money in the picture, right? To some extent, the evolutionary theory that I presented here today, I think we can also use to think about this, because there are different kinds of interactions that are there in our evolutionary past, and maybe our preferences are also have evolved to be adapted to the kind of interaction, right? So if I interact with members within my family, I will not act in the same way as if this was a group of strangers, right? And there is something to even, maybe you have cousins living far away from you that you don't meet very often. But I mean, from when I meet my cousins, whom I don't meet often at all, essentially never, it's something special still, right? I mean, they're my cousins, and it's weird. It's very strange, I think. But there is something to these family ties, and what codes for that, I don't know exactly, but it's something special. And so maybe, when we interact in markets, also there's something maybe that we have evolved for sufficient amount of time for such interactions to trigger more selfishness. I mean, it's just a hypothesis, but indeed this assortativity that we have in our model can be different in different kinds of interactions, and could therefore have triggered different preferences for different kinds of interactions.
Thank you, John, for pointing these names. I'll surely look
Okay,
into this.
sure, yeah.
All right, I think that's all.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We can't thank you enough. It was such an interesting topic.
Okay.
extremely enjoyable to listen to. And thanks for answering the questions as well. This was the opening seminar of the union of the semester. By the way, it was we kicked off with such a lovely topic. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, for for this, and bravo for this kind of initiative that you have. It's great, and I very much enjoyed interacting with you. Okay. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Have a nice evening.
Yes.
Goodbye. Thanks.
You too. Bye bye.